Hello folks, this is Mr. O'Brien and welcome to the third and final From Artisan to Worker presentation. In this presentation we will be closely reading some storefronts to see the slow, gradual change from that of the artisan storefront to a factory or department store type setting. Exciting stuff. Alright, let's move on. Alright, so the traditional artisan store. Let's look at the note underneath here. In the illustration heading, the chapter on tailoring in Edward Hazen's, quote, Panorama of Professions and Trades, that's the name of his publication, first published in 1836, the master measures the customer, as you can see there, and calls off the measurements to an apprentice. The cutting shears that the master will use later lie on the counter between them. On another counter, sitting in the traditional cross-legged position of the tailor, are two journeymen or apprentices, one sewing, the other pressing. All face inward to the center of the room. That matters. They're all facing the same direction. While a half-open door leads to an undefined space, possibly only to a staircase to living quarters. This was published in 1836, when tailoring and many other trades were beginning to change away from this kind of setting. But this is still the traditional storefront. The way people are facing, the way they are positioned, the clothes they are wearing, all are meant to show that society as a whole did not look at the master craftsman, the journeyman, or the apprentice as a rigid hierarchy. Alright, no one is shown really as superior to anybody else. There may be a little bit of a hierarchy of skill, but it's going to be nothing compared to what you are going to see. Alright, so again, this is reflective of what society thought of this. Labor was a good thing. They were all in this together. What we're going to notice is how this begins to change, and gradually. So this again was 1836. Moving on. First signs of change through the 19th century. Alright, so you see the shoe store on the back left with the retailer selling his shoes and a journeyman shoemaker sitting in the background workshop. Or in the picture it's the foreground, in the store it's the background. Let's look at the notes. The apron-clad shoemaker sits at the bench, next to a window, which suggests a pleasant scene. His work, his tools, and the random clutter of the workshop are quite traditional. What is new is the retail shoe store just beyond the open doorway. An uncluttered space in which a fully suited man, who wasn't fully suited in the previous picture, at least there wasn't a difference between the journeyman and the retailer. Obviously the master of the store and workshop waits upon a well-dressed female customer. Remember, the first picture we looked at, the previous slide, was a clothier. You know, it was a haberdasher, a tailor for men. So they're going to wear nicer clothing. That's a little bit different. The shoe dealer is not emphasized, but the shoemaker is clearly a journeyman. And the proprietor of this quaint little shop is a quite modern 19th century retailer. So you see labor is getting pushed to the back. It's something more to be ashamed of. He's still the focus of the image. He's still twice the size of the retailer, but it's changing. The former master craftsman is now out in front. He's the one who's interacting with customers and wearing a suit. Alright, now we get to some more change. More gradual change. So in this particular image, the foreground workshop is here, clearly divided into two spaces, and the premises as a whole into three. On the left, facing left, is the skilled cutter, working in shirt sleeves but otherwise quite well dressed. Beyond the very lightly shaded doorway, this time in a background retail store that occupies the center of the illustration, stands the master tailor or clothier, who wears his jacket while he measures a customer. The master's back is turned to the cutter in the foreground shop. Their backs are facing each other, that matters. On the right side of the workshop, visually separated from the master, the customer, and the cutter by a large prominent stovepipe, and coal shuttle, crowd four less skilled workers, two male sewers who sit cross-legged by the window, a female sewing machine operator, and a male presser. All appear to be younger than the cutter and the master. None is well dressed, and they all face the light of the window and hence away from their superiors. Hierarchy. So in at least three ways: dress, placement within the premises, and orientation, the direction they're facing, the image established the hierarchy of relations within this less traditional tailor shop. To be sure, it is a hierarchy of skill, but it also sets the storekeeping businessman above his hardworking artisanal employees. This is a clue. This image is a clue to the changing realities and perceptions of manual work in the years following the Civil War. Now we get to the birth of the department store by the 1850s. So as in this picture, you see a carpet store that is designed by Nathan A. Bradley and was not a larger store by this time, and that's also new, hiring someone to design your store for you. During this decade, other retailers, particularly dry goods stores, in textiles, sheets, not hardware, not groceries. They were not quite yet department stores. They were building huge emporia, sometimes absorbing whole city blocks and providing rows of fashionable goods. All right, let's look at Lord & Taylor, for example. That popped up by 1860. Let's look at the notes. So as retailers and other non-manual, not working with their hands, workers, they embellished the exteriors of their buildings. They also transformed the interior as well, and in the process created work environments of unprecedented elegance and dignity for themselves and their clerks. These buildings, like a Lord & Taylor pick in this slide, became a shopping and tourist destination for prosperous, meaning wealthy and middle-class clients. Being a retail clerk was still, up until this time, a male job of respect. The expectation had been that the clerk was a sort of apprentice, and a store of his own was an eventuality. But by the late 1850s, 1860s, the job of sales clerk was quickly becoming more or less a female job of little pay and no advancement. So they were losing their ladder to climb. All right, so whether the retail establishment was a jewelry store, like you see here, a bookstore, like you see here, or a hat store, a milliner, like you see here, far greater care was taken to depict the richly ornamented interior of the store to show the variety of attractiveness of the goods being sold there. In other words, the shopping experience was being sold, not solely the items. So this is an example of a store that catered to clients that were less prosperous. It was simply clean, orderly, and the workers wore suits. Still, the die was cast. The change was happening. The store that the customers saw was to show no physical labor. It was intended to recreate the parlor found in the home. Think of a department store. The home goods are already set up. As a result, those who made the items, labor, were unseen, as were thoughts of their work conditions. So the implication was their condition didn't matter as much anymore. Labor was something less to be proud of, more to be ashamed of. Something to hide, in other words. The lives, the work conditions, the wealth, and the social status of manual workers, mechanics, artisans, versus that of non-manual, artisans who had become retailers, management class, had diverged significantly. Whereas before the market revolution, their lives were not all that different. Now they were changing. The gap between them was getting larger. The wealth gap, the gap in their standard of living was getting larger. All right, remember this is during the Jacksonian era. Okay, let's move on. So, by 1850, what you see here was becoming a more common sight, namely architect designed blocks of storefronts with almost identical facades. All right, let's move on. All right, so some notes here. Number one, workers did not readily adjust to the demands of the factory. Remember, their pre-industrial values were clashing with the expectations of the factory's setting. Though these workers were used to long hours, they were not acclimated to the strict regimen involved in working in a factory. Absenteeism was common among workers whose interests now differed from their employers. Since work was now more of a drudgery, people call in more, so to speak. A much more rigid separation between work and leisure developed, that psychological wall, that mental wall between work and leisure. And life was being separated into two spheres in this particular context, work and leisure. And since work was now something to be dreaded, so to speak, free time was something to kind of live it up, have fun. So leisure should be sports. Leisure sports like taverns emerged. Baseball, I'm sorry, that's correct. Leisure spots like taverns emerged. All right, as did leisure activities like spectator sports, boxing, and baseball emerge. All right, so the effect of machines. The illustrations of mechanized hat making that accompanied a Scientific American article in 1876 depict the somber surroundings in which the new machines were operated. Unfinished factory floors, dark brick and block walls, a grimy, utterly blank window through which three felt makers standing over their machine have neither reason nor time to look. These were the facts of industrial life by the 1860s, by the Civil War era. So we begin with the storefront at the very first slide. We now get to this. This is the transition. So this brings us to the last slide, the cash economy. The introduction of the cash economy led to the decline of the barter system, trading goods for goods. People were being pushed into the cash economy, farmers and so forth. Worker contact with employers came through the pay envelope. Remember I said that with the previous video quiz. That was increasingly the workers' connection to their employer. Workers took advantage of the lack of ties to move about in search of better jobs because they had less of a sense of loyalty. Turnover was a big deal. For example, Henry Ford in his Ford factory had to hire 3 people to fill every one position in the factory because so many people left their jobs. I mean, do you wonder why? So laborers saw themselves as free, able to move about to new jobs. And because of this market revolution, this transition from artisan to employee, class begins to emerge by the early 19th century, where people begin to think a certain way largely because of the class they are in. So class refers to how much money you have or don't have, but also how you think about certain things, like the wealthy thinking that the poor just need to go out and get a job, and the poor thinking the wealthy are greedy and selfish, and the middle class thinking that the poor just have to get a job, and the rich are greedy and self-interested and should share the wealth more. So class refers to how much money you make, but also what you think about certain things. This begins to develop much more rigidly during the market revolution. So do not forget to take the quiz that will pop up right now.